So good evening. Welcome to this new webinar organized by Biomimicry Switzerland. My name is Sonja Donau-Adams, and on behalf of our association, I'm happy to welcome you all. Also welcome Michelle. Behind the scenes, she is the technical support. Biomimicry Switzerland is back with another webinar with this new format. We wish to bring biomimicry, its principles and applications closer to a wider public and raise awareness about this great lens for tackling all different types of challenges we face today, be they technical, social, or global. Welcome to Sara El-Sayed. She will educate us today about regenerative food systems. And before I pass it on to Sara, a few housekeeping rules. Sara will lead us through a presentation for the first 20 minutes. Please feel free to post your questions in the meantime in the chat. She will answer them then at the end. The second part is a very interactive one. It is devoted to interactions and Q&A. So do not be shy, unmute yourself and just go for it. Interactivity is what we want to have, what we're looking for. So I hand it over to Michelle. She will introduce Sara, and from then on, Sara will take it over. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you, Sonja, and welcome, Sara El-Sayed. As Sonja was saying, we are very happy to have Sara part of this webinar series. Sara has a position as the co-director of the Biomimicry Center and assistant research professor at the Swette Center for Sustainable Food Systems. She has a doctorate in food system sustainability, specifically on regenerative food practices in arid regions, and a master's in biomimicry both from ASU. Her and I also both have the same biomimicry professional certificate from Biomimicry 3.8, and that's how we have met personally. And she also held a postdoctoral position at the School for Future Innovation and Society in Public Interest Technology. Her research interests include exploring ways to have more regenerative and net positive local food systems. She's the co-founder also of several enterprises in Egypt focused around social enterprises, food systems, education, and sustainability. She's also on the board for Slow Food, an international movement that started in Italy, aiming to safeguard local food cultures and traditions, and does so by promoting good, clean, and fair food for all. She's also an avid traveler, nature lover, enjoys really good food, and also makes good food. And she enjoys cooking, interacting with people through food experiences. So the stage is yours, Sara.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Sonja, for the introductions and for having me here. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I have a slideshow prepared for you all. So I'm not going to go through this because you've already done this, Michelle, my introduction, but what I'm hoping to do for the next 20 minutes, and I hope to stay on time, is to take you through a few stories of my own personal journeys in the past decade or so, and then my research journeys that have taken me to weave biomimicry and traditional ecological knowledge together. And so this is the contents of this presentation. I'm going to talk about post-Egyptian revolution and then my move to Arizona. So I come from Egypt and I moved to Arizona about 6 years ago, and then giving you a little bit of a context about food systems, and then the work that I did in my research of weaving biomimicry and traditional ecological knowledge in understanding how to conceptualize arid regions and food systems in them, and then a few examples of my research on the models of regeneration, and then a little snippet of the podcast that I created. So post-Egyptian revolution, in 2011, Egypt went through a big upheaval where, people went down to the streets and essentially had enough of the system, the status quo. And what that brought about, other than changing the government, was there was a resurgence of feeling like we could make a difference in our country and really trying to take ownership of how we can transform our country. And from there, I and a number of people co-founded a number of different organizations. So one of them is Nawaya, which means in Arabic, good intentions. And this project essentially worked with small-scale farming communities to try and transition them into sustainable farming practices. And on the left side is a picture of me working with some farmers and some city folks on learning how to do composting, different types of composting practices. And then at the same time, I was also, studying for biomimicry, and there was this opportunity to also try and teach our youth about nature strategies, and really understanding like that biomimicry context and bringing it to youth. So we set up a company called Daima that does these experiences, these journeys. We take students from different ages, from different contexts of Egypt to other communities in Egypt to kind of learn about the nature of these ecosystems, and to learn how we can learn from these different strategies of these ecosystems, as well as the communities that live in them. And I also set up a little company called Cleola that does low-tech irrigation systems. So that was kind of like the impetus of like this transformation that kind of took place. And it gives you a little bit about my context. Sorry. And then about 6 years ago, I actually transitioned to start my PhD, and I moved to Arizona, which happened to be another desert. And I found it very interesting that I started discovering that there was so many similarities in these two locations. So Egypt is a desert ecosystem like Arizona. Both of them have important rivers that cross through them, albeit in Arizona, some of them have been dammed off to the extent that now they're not really as functional anymore. But what was fascinating is that in their histories, and this is a really interesting image, the top image is of the pyramids and what it would have looked like 3,000-4,000 years ago, after they were built, but by the people growing along the banks of the river with canal systems and productions of wheat and rotations that they had. But they also shared a similarity with the Hohokam people, who are the original inhabitants of the Sonoran Desert, where I am now in Arizona. Also have intricate canal systems with smaller plots of land where they would grow a variety of different crops. And fascinatingly enough, the canal systems in both these lands, both Egypt and Arizona, still exist till today. They are the blueprint that is being used for irrigating lands in Egypt, and in the US, in Arizona, they are mostly for stormwater collection, but they're the same canal systems in the same locations that they were laid out. So that got me thinking that these two spaces have lessons that I could be learning from, of maybe how we can envision better systems for food production in these arid regions. Arid regions are quite a challenge in growing food, as you may know. They're places that don't get a lot of rainfall. They are places that often have soils that are not nutrient rich for food production. And so they offer a lot of different challenges to try and produce food. However, what we learn from history, but also from communities today that are finding different solutions, that there are actually a lot of answers that are offered of how you can build food systems in these kind of environments. And the premise of my research is that if we could find interesting models of how to create food in these harsher environments that typically are not thought of as food producing ones, they could also offer us lessons of how we can produce food in a world that is ever changing because of climate change, becoming drier in certain areas, becoming less wet in other areas, and so forth. So just to give you a little bit of a context, the kind of system of food that we live in, there are multiple ones that are kind of defined. So typically in the United States, I don't know how it's like in Switzerland, but in the United States and across the globe, there's a very industrialized food system. And so we talk about agriculture that is using heavy machinery, that is dependent on certain types of seeds that are either highly modified or genetically modified in certain cases. They are produced for intensification, and this kind of came out of the notion of the Green Revolution, with scholars like Burlog really working on the intensification of wheats. And this kind of agriculture has perpetuated a whole system around it that's quite industrial, that requires heavy machinery to gather the foods. It requires machinery to then sort it and clean it. It also relies on another system of transportation that can move these goods around, and also is reliant on big mergers of companies that then distribute the food. So this is kind of like the largest and the most of the food is produced in this system here in the United States. As you can imagine, the system has created a lot of damage to our ecosystems, to the earth. It's created a lot of damage for small-scale producers. It's also created a lot of damage in terms of health issues that have kind of come about. And even though it wasn't the intention of industrializing the food system was to allow food to reach masses, to have more accessible food. But it has come with consequences. And so in the 90s, a move started taking place for a more sustainable food system. And that came with a series of different metrics. So organics, for example, started growing heavily in that period. Different types of certifications, farmers markets started popping up. A new kind of system was trying to be created to counter the industrial food system. However, recently, and this is kind of the premise of the research that I've done, a new term has come around, which is the word regenerative. And it gets used in many different spaces, but it talks about taking it a step even further. So sustainable is like saying we are going to try and alleviate the harms of this industrial food system by trying to make it less bad. But what regenerative is trying to say is no. Creating food and agriculture and food production can actually have a positive impact onto our environment. It can have a net positive impact. So in order to understand that, I want to talk to you a little bit about the term regenerative agriculture. So this has become a term that is quite known in the space of agriculture. And so when I say food system, I'm not just talking about agriculture, I'm talking about a whole food system, but I'm now going to delve into what regenerative agriculture looks like. So often it is described as a form of agriculture where you are trying to replicate strategies in nature and not overpower it. So typically in industrial agriculture, there's a lot of tillage that takes place. So trying to scratch the surface of the soil to move it around so that you prepare it for the next crop. With regenerative, there's very minimal of that. You're trying to protect the soil and keep organic matter on it and keep living plant matter on it. You're trying to maintain the roots. You're trying to increase the crop diversity. So it's not about one production. And you're integrating livestock. And some of these practices include holistic grazing as one way of doing that. So holistic grazing is when animals are actually trying, so you're raising cattle, for example, and you're mimicking how animals, large animals would look like in a natural ecosystem. And so if you think of in Africa, you have wildebeests, or in the Americas, you have the bisons. These are large herds of animals that are going through grasslands. And as they do that, they are trampling the soil, they are defecating in it, but they move, so they don't stay in one location. The way we raise animals is that we keep them in one location. So holistic grazing took inspiration from how these natural systems look like and started creating these paddocks where animals would actually be moved from one location to another, so that by the time they come back to the first location they were on, it might take them a year to come back to the spot. And therefore that allows for the soil to kind of regenerate. So that's holistic grazing. Growing in polycultures, the idea of not growing one crop variety. So if you remember the picture that I put of both the industrial and the sustainable farming, it is one crop that is grown because it's easier to harvest it. But polycultures are systems where you have different types of crops grown together. So here, this is in New Mexico, where they're growing amaranth and corn and sunflower seeds and all these different varieties together in this way that actually benefits each other. Agroforestry is another form of regenerative agriculture. And so this is not trying to grow a forest just for building an ecosystem, but actually for food production. So here, this is a model in North Africa of date palms grown with olive groves, and in the understory you have different types of broad beans that are grown. So you have these layers that are mimicking how a forest ecosystem would look like, with the several layers of canopy that kind of support each other. So these are all examples of this space of regenerative agriculture. But what I wanted to see is there a system, a food system that we can think of that is kind of regenerative? And through my research, I came through putting together this definition of what a regenerative food system is. So it's a whole systems approach to food. One that is place-based, so you're looking at a certain location, you really need to understand the place you're in, integrating what are known as agroecological or nature-inspired solutions. So looking at how would nature create food in these places while being engaged civically and economically. It is a system that produces flavorful and culturally appropriate food. So it's not just mass-produced food, but it's food that makes sense to the people that are consuming it, and has an ecologically net positive impact. So it is not a matter of soils being depleted, carbon being released, but rather it is about bringing back that carbon into the soil. It is about creating a net positive kind of ecological impact, and doing that while achieving social justice, as well as intergenerational and interspecies justice. So intergenerational meaning that we are thinking about the future generations as we are creating these systems, as well as thinking of the species that are supporting it. So that's kind of the definition that came together through the kind of few years of research that I was working on. Now, that all actually brought together these two very interesting fields, which are biomimicry, and I'm going to give a little bit of a snippet about it in a second, and traditional ecological knowledge, which I will also introduce. So as you, I assume, know, people who are coming to this talk are familiar, at least with biomimicry. It is this field of looking at nature strategies and models and trying to emulate them for sustainable designs. So the idea is nature has, all these years, 3.8 billion years of experience, of essentially research and development, of adapting and evolving to be the best fit on this planet. And so nature offers these fantastic strategies for us to create sustainable systems. And then the other field is traditional ecological knowledge, knowledge of indigenous and traditional communities. This is knowledge that has been passed down from one generation to the next. This could be through stories, through songs, through all sorts of different ways of passing down the knowledge, often not written one, but oral histories. And it is about being relational. And so these two fields together offer really great insights on how we can actually build food systems that are ones that are net positive, are ones that are offering beyond sustainable solutions, essentially. So I just wanted to highlight traditional ecological knowledge can sometimes be called TEK as an acronym, or indigenous knowledges, or native science. And this is not new to the people in biomimicry. So Janine Benyus, who's kind of the name behind biomimicry in the modern world, often talks about the importance of indigenous knowledge. And she says that biomimicry is an approach to innovation is not new. Indigenous peoples have relied heavily on the lessons and examples of the organisms around them. So Alaskan hunters will still stalk seals in this exact same way that polar bears do. And then indigenous scholar Robin Wall Kimmerer will say, if we're looking for models of self-sustaining communities, we need look no further than an old growth forest or the old growth cultures they raised in symbiosis with them. So for my research, what I did was, I looked at different principles that exist in the space of food systems. I came up with a definition, which I've just shared with you. And from there, I realized I wanted to look closer at the principles of life, of biomimicry, and the principles of traditional ecological knowledge. And from there, I wove those together with interviews that I conducted in the Southwest United States, as well as North Africa. And from there, I developed this framework, which weaves together these two different principles. So you can imagine this spiral here, and the spiral was intentional because it is a very important symbol in both indigenous knowledge, but also in nature. The idea is that it emulates growth. You can see the principles of biomimicry and indigenous knowledge kind of lined up together to kind of see how we could think and conceptualize a regenerative food system. So they come from, this framework comes from looking at life's principles, which is a framework used within biomimicry. It's a set of 26 principles that basically say this is how nature works. Nature evolves. Nature adapts to changing conditions. It's locally attuned. And then on the right side are principles that have been extrapolated from the way that indigenous people kind of view the world. So this includes knowledges of the landscape, adaptability, dreams and visions. And what I did was weave these together to kind of try and think of what a regenerative food system would look like. And from there, I lined them up. So these are the life principles on the left side and the indigenous TEK principles on the right side, the ones that kind of matched up together. And for each one, I created a definition and examples of practices that exist. And so I'm not going to go through this whole thing. I'm just going to give you a few stories of some of them, some of these models of regeneration. So local attunement.
We have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, perfect. So local attunement and place-based knowledge as one is the ability to fit into the surrounding environment, understanding that there are cycles that are specific to place, of how to eat that is adapted to the land. And so the Tohono O'odham people, who are the inhabitants of the Sonoran Desert, where I'm currently at, have multiple growing seasons. They can grow wheat and greens, and they have agave groves, and the agave groves act both as stabilizers for the soil, but also as food and medicine. But they also have a diversification of their diets. So they don't only grow food, but they forage for mesquite and palo verde, and they also hunt for rabbit, for example. So it's a really feeding themselves based on being locally attuned to this place. So this is one example, one model. Another principle that came out is this idea of cultivating cooperative relationships, and that term gets referred to in indigenous knowledge as relationality, that nature thrives on cooperative relationships and mutualisms, but also indigenous communities, they strive on these bonds that they create among their people. And relationality is a really important aspect for indigenous communities. They are in relation with not just people, but the creations, the cosmos, plants and animals. And it's seen through their prayers and the care that they give to their seeds and to their crops. Oftentimes, indigenous people will start, a workshop or a meal through a prayer where they thank all these different organisms and and even the rocks and so forth. Another principle is idea of leveraging cyclic processes, that there are cycles that we're dependent on, negative and positive feedback loops that allow for self-regulation. And this is translated into a reciprocity that takes place amongst the indigenous people. But what is interesting is you can also see how indigenous communities have leveraged their understanding of place. So the pictures here depict images from both New Mexico and Arizona, where indigenous folks have built before monsoonal seasons dikes and earthworks, essentially, to try and capture the rain so that they can make use of them in a way that actually allows for production to take place during the monsoons, which is the heavy rains they get in August. On the left side is a picture on higher mountains where they also get these heavy rains, but they're growing corn that is rain-fed, and it's a relationship that they've built with the seeds that they have harvested from year to year, that they grow up to 1 meter into the ground where the seed is grown, and then all it needs is the rain for it to feed it. So it's this really close understanding with the cycles of the earth. And then the last principle I wanted to highlight is the idea of low energy processes. So in nature, one of the most important forms of energy is low energy processes, not high energy processes like we create a lot of our products in our world. Same kind of concept is also used with indigenous communities who use low energy processes for preserving some of their foods, preserving the different seed varieties, fermenting different types of foods. And so these are just examples that are all highlighted in my research, in my paper. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with is just a few seconds of a podcast that I created where I interviewed a number of different people to hear their voices as they're talking about these kind of spaces. So I hope you can hear it.
Sarah, did you share with computer audio, because we don't hear it?
No,
Oh,
I don't hear it
okay.
either.
Sorry, 1 second, I'm gonna do it again.
Hello everyone, my name is Carson Kiburo.
My name's Lillian.
I am Roxanne Swensel.
We were actually given the technology and the tools to thrive and to live a meaningful life on Mother Earth.
Native people are very resilient just because we're still here.
Change may be slow, but the baby steps seem very huge to me.
We're indigenous, all of us, to this planet.
There's a time to plant, there's a time to harvest, there's a time to allow the earth to rest, and there's a time to honor those spiritual forces that we have developed relationships with.
Tour the world. Go get educated. Native people literally live in two worlds. You know, we live in a world,
and the greenhouse is just always full of
the Indian community,
cucumbers,
the Indian reservation, culture and tradition.
tomatoes,
We also live in this bigger world called the United States.
basil,
And we also live in a much bigger world called the globe.
kales, lettuces, spinaches. There's always something growing in the greenhouse.
Get down on your hands and knees and touch the ground. That's your mama. She can help you find your place again.
Thank you. Here are a few resources if you need. So this is the link to the podcast and my article. And if you want to learn more about where I work, this is the Biomimicry Center.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this great and inspiring talk. I could have listened much longer. Thanks very much for all these beautiful pictures and this comparison of the two worlds. It really was really inspiring. I saw there is already one question in the chat. It's from Michaela, and she asks if these regenerative food systems have an additional benefit in keeping invasive species at bay, or are they also threatened by them?
So, I mean, the idea of a regenerative system is to really understand your ecosystem. So a really big part of it is like understanding your place. And so part of it is trying to also stack beneficial kind of crops together. So here, for example, one plant that we have that is an invasive is a type of grass that has been introduced. But when you try to really rebuild soil, what you're doing is you're trying to fortify your soil by bringing in the crops that you kind of are familiar with. And with time, the idea is that it would push away the ones that you are not selecting for, because the idea is that humans and the plants are creating a relationship together. However, one of the challenges of regenerative food systems is that they take time. And so we're not patient enough. So it's not like you're going to get rid of an invasive species next season. It might take you 5-10 years before you've built enough of the crops, the local crops, and reintroduce them in a way that actually supports that. So yes and no is the answer.
Arti, do I spell it right?
Yes.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. I live a bit further south from Egypt. I'm based in Kenya, which is 80% asal, arid and semi-arid. And yeah, I think one of the challenges, and how do we turn it around, is sort of getting policymakers really to appreciate the indigenous knowledge, right? So to give you an extreme example, and then I'll work backwards to say what we want to do instead of what the government wants us to do. The government wants us to produce 1 square kilometer of wheat in remote northern Kenya. Why? Because the Ethiopians are selling wheat to the Kenyans, and we surely can't allow for that to happen. So what we're saying is, okay, if you want to grow food, which is not sort of an indigenous thing with pastoralists, they sort of, move around the land with their livestock, etc. But if you do want to start growing food because you want people to settle, then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have to build the soil. We're going to put 20 centimeters of crushed rocks, because with all the volcanic activity, we have shallow basalt in this part of the world. And that basalt will remineralize the soil. But in order to get there, we have to do applied research, and we have to do early commercial scale research, and then we finally get to your goal. So going back to your point, when we tell them the earliest we can even start building the soil in Marsabit in northern Kenya is year 4. They don't like, they say, no, we want to start yesterday. Well, first of all, find the money to do the research. And secondly, building 20 centimeters of soil is going to take time. We're going to have to put cover crops, etc. So I guess my point is, while all of this is fantastic, and it's how to convince the people sitting in capital cities like Nairobi that this actually matters.
I think what I've seen from the research I've done both in North Africa and in here in the southern part of the United States, Southwest, is these small models. So people create these small models and then they show the policymakers. It's the bottom up, it's show the models, show the success, show the soil, really start creating a network between the different farms and the different organizations, and then that becomes the model, but not the opposite way around, because you're moving at like 2 different trajectories essentially. And so I'm finding, at least here in the United States, that the movement of indigenous communities in the food space has become really powerful, but only today, I think, is it starting to get the attention of policymakers and so forth, even though they haven't stopped producing and growing and creating their food systems ever. Like that's been a continuous thing. Maybe it got interrupted at the beginning of the last century with the boarding schools, where they were completely removed from their lands and forced into like a boarding school system and being assimilated into the American kind of education system. So maybe they lost it a little bit in that period. But I would say that today, these models are now starting to be used as examples, and even the terminology of indigenous knowledge systems is now being adopted by the White House and by policymakers, and that conversation is starting. So I wouldn't even go towards Nairobi and the government yet until there are, these models, because do you really need them? Like, that's the question. Like, can you create systems where there's local resources and local finances? Because there are people who are convinced of this stuff. It just, the scaling of it, I think, is at a different level, I think. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, no, I mean, I fully agree with you, by the way. And Kenya is a great example of where grassroots, if you get the policymakers involved too early, they can kill ideas. I think in this case, we've already attracted attention for whatever reason. But no, I absolutely agree with you. So how do we get that?
I think what an amazing model in Kenya is actually the informal tech industry that kind of blew out of hand. I feel like there's all these innovations that take place in Nairobi in these small kind of illegal settlements and so forth that now are becoming like a model the world is looking at of how you can build technology from the bottom up. So definitely Kenya is a space to learn from.
There is one note from Michaela in the chat. She thinks biomimicry can be a very good tool for communicating the cyclic aspect of these food systems. Michaela, do you want to go into more detail about that?
Yeah, well, I was thinking, biomimicry, as we know, is not a new practice. But to policymakers in the global south, maybe biomimicry will be more appealing than indigenous knowledge. I don't know if that is a very outside view, but I know it's sometimes difficult to explain to people in Switzerland as well that our grandparents did it right and we broke it, kind of thing. And we need to revert to olden ways. Maybe by changing the name or the label on it, it can kind of sound more appealing. I don't know what you ladies from Africa think about that.
I personally think that indigenous knowledge needs to be acknowledged. And so I think that there's work that's being done at multiple fronts. One big space is in academia, actually. So there's a lot more indigenous scholars that are now in academic spaces making their case of the importance of the knowledge systems that they have grown up with and have passed from one generation to another. So I think again, it's another slow process, but I think it is important that it gets acknowledged because it has its own value. But I agree with what you're saying. I think one of the interesting things that my work and the work the Biomimicry Center is kind of trying to work on here at ASU is like, how do we bring in these worlds together of Western science and indigenous sciences together? How can they speak the same kind of language? How can we learn from each other so that we don't recreate the same mistakes in different sectors? So I know that, for example, in the United States, the forestry services are starting to look at how do we start working on models of reforestry that actually learn from how indigenous peoples have managed forests for a very long time, because they have a better sense and we are not doing a good job of managing some of the forest. So there's these conversations are starting to take place in certain spaces, but I think that both need to have an equal weight.
Sara, you spoke a lot about the similarities of both of the countries. Are there any differences we can learn from?
From the two regions, there are a lot of differences. I mean, definitely the cultures are very different, right? You're talking about a predominantly Muslim region, North Africa, and a predominantly either Christian influence here in the Southwest, or indigenous people who have their own cosmological beliefs, and so they have their own kind of belief systems, their own spirituality, and that creates a level of complexity because you're dealing with a lot of nuances and differences of how people relate to their belief system. So that's definitely one big difference. I would say another significant one is the amount of rainfall. So that's a physical difference. So the Southwest is considered a desert, but really there's a lot of water that comes down. It's we get summer monsoonal rains, and then you have these cycles of about 10 years where you also have some strong winter rains, and there's a cycle of 100 years that also gets like some significant rains. This has been a bit disrupted by climate change, but the big difference is North Africa's original ecosystem, which used to be a savanna land, so there's research that shows that it used to be a savanna land, has completely been disrupted by, unfortunately, the Roman Empire using places like North Africa as the granary of the Roman Empire, and so had deforested this area so that they could, grow wheat and so forth. So that natural ecosystem, the microclimates that would have been there, are no longer present, and so rain patterns look very different. I think this is two big differences. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the chat, or
Yes,
somebody?
I would like to know a little bit more about your podcast. What are the aims of the podcast, and where can we find it?
So the podcast was done purely for my PhD. So it's a one-time thing. There are 5 episodes and that's it. It's on Anchor. I can put a link in the chat. And the idea behind it was to give voice to the people. So the typical research that I was doing was just interviews and focus groups. And usually these are just names that end up in a research paper in an academic journal, and it ends there. But I wanted to give voice to those people that I was talking to and have them tell their stories. And so the idea is that it does that, essentially tries to give a voice. And so I can put a link in the chat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. But talking about podcasts, soon, me and another professor called Melissa Nelson, who's an indigenous scholar here at Arizona State University, and Lily Ehrman, who has her own podcast called, oh my God, what's it called? Nature, what? It's about biomimicry. So Lily Ehrman does a podcast about biomimicry, and Melissa Nelson does a podcast about indigenous knowledge. And so the 3 of us are collaborating on a special issue of 5 episodes that are going to be conversations between people in biomimicry and people in indigenous spaces, talking to each other around a specific topic. We hope to be launching it in October, and so we'll send you the link if you are all interested then. So it'll be shown in the 2 platforms of these podcasts, Nature Conservancy and Lily's one, which is called With Nature, or hold on, I need to find it.
Lily Learns from Nature.
Yeah, Lily Learns from Nature. Yeah, that's what it's called.
Yeah. I think for the sake of time, we are coming to an end. Is there a last question or a last comment? Anyone who wants to speak up? No? Sara, I really loved your presentation, and I really love the topic. I hope we all can help to scale up, because it's important. I really loved the part in the podcast about these women kissing the earth, kissing the mama.
Yeah,
it's so important. It really touched me, and I think we should spread these ideas, and that's the idea behind the Biomimicry Institute in Switzerland. And so we try to help to spread these great, magnificent ideas to the world. Thanks
so much.
Thanks for accepting our invitation, and maybe one of you three can come back once the podcast is done, but please make sure to share the link when it is done. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you all. Thank you for the background technical issues. Michelle, thanks to the audience for the questions, for supporting us, for staying with us. And before we go, we're always looking for new and interesting topics. So if you have some ideas you want to hear about, maybe you fill out the survey form, or you direct contact us in the chat, or you can contact us directly. So reach out anytime. We want to keep this series for free. So if you have some spare money, we gladly accept any donations. But yeah, thank you very much for spending the time with us, and we hope to see you soon. Next
Bye-bye.
podcast. The next webinar is on the 12th of April, and I will have Emily Vanish. She's from South Africa, and we will talk about what hotels and bees and flowers have in common. So a very different topic then. See you soon. Have a good time.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sonia.
You.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.